The auction paddle trembled in Cordelia Whitmore's weathered hands as she watched the millionaires around her bid casually on horses worth more than her entire life savings. The grand auction house buzzed with the energy of Montana's elite, their designer boots clicking against marble floors while they discussed six-figure purchases as if ordering coffee. Cordelia clutched her single crumpled dollar bill, her last, and wondered what madness had driven her to this moment. The elderly woman in worn denim and a faded flannel shirt looked like a tumbleweed that had blown in from the prairie, utterly out of place among the diamond-encrusted crowd. "Lot 17!" the auctioneer's voice boomed. And Cordelia's heart nearly stopped. A collective gasp rippled through the audience as the doors to the holding pen swung open. Tempest emerged like a force of nature made flesh. The wild Mustang Stallion stood nearly 17 hands high, his coat the color of storm. Clouds, with a mane that flowed like liquid silver in the arena lights. But it was his eyes that stole every breath in the room, deep amber orbs that burned with untamed fire and an intelligence that seemed almost human. He had been captured from the Nevada ranges just 3 months ago, one of the last truly wild herds. Despite the best efforts of professional trainers, Tempest remained unbroken, his spirit as fierce as the day he ran free across the desert. Several wealthy buyers had already tried and failed to purchase him from private sellers, only to return him when he proved impossible to handle. This magnificent creature represents the very essence of American freedom, the auctioneer announced, his voice carrying a reverence reserved for legends. Bidding starts at $50,000. Immediately, paddles shot up around the room. Cordelia watched in awe as the price climbed. 60,000, 75, 100,000. The bidders included Maximilian Rothschild, heir to a banking fortune, and Prudence Ashworth, who owned the largest ranch in 3 states. "Don't even think about it, old woman," sneered Maximilian, having noticed Cordelia's wide-eyed stare. "This horse belongs with people who can afford to give him the life he deserves. Don't waste your bid on dreams beyond your reach." Prudence nodded in agreement, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her gold-plated paddle. "Some things are simply out of league for people like you, dear. Perhaps you should consider the petting zoo animals instead." Their words stung, but Cordelia's gaze remained fixed on Tempest. Something impossible passed between them, a recognition that defied explanation. The stallion's wild eyes found hers across the crowded arena, and in that moment, she saw not a beast to be tamed, but a kindred spirit calling out to another soul who understood what it meant to be overlooked, underestimated, and forgotten by a world that valued only wealth and status. The bidding continued to soar. 200,000. 300,000. Cordelia closed her eyes and remembered why she had come here with nothing but hope and a single-dollar bill. This wasn't about money. It never had been. This was about something far more precious and infinitely more powerful than all the gold in their bank accounts. When she opened her eyes, Tempest was still watching her, waiting. The bidding war raged like a wildfire, consuming everything in its path. Cordelia watched the astronomical numbers climb, 400,000, 500,000, while her heart hammered against her ribs. The millionaires around her had forgotten she existed, their attention focused entirely on outbidding each other for the prize stallion. Maximilian's face grew red with frustration as Prudence continued to counter his every bid. 600,000! He shouted, his voice echoing through the marble halls. 650,000! Prudence fired back, her composure cracking slightly as the sum reached even her comfort zone. But something strange was happening in the arena. While the wealthy bidders focused on their battle of egos, Tempest had begun to pace restlessly, his powerful muscles rippling beneath his storm-gray coat. The stallion's amber eyes never left Cordelia's face, and she could swear she saw something desperate in his gaze, a plea that transcended the barriers between human and animal. The professional horse handlers noticed the change too. Tempest, who had been aggressive and unpredictable since his capture, had grown almost calm, his attention fixed on the elderly woman in the back row. One handler whispered to another, pointing discreetly at the unusual behavior. 700,000. Maximilian's voice cracked with strain. The auctioneer looked around the room, his practiced eyes searching for any remaining bidders. $700,000. Going once. Cordelia's mouth went dry. She knew what she had to do, even if it seemed impossible, even if it meant risking everything on a dream that defied all logic. Her arthritic fingers tightened around her dollar bill as she struggled to find her voice. $700,000, going twice. In the arena, Tempest suddenly reared up on his hind legs, his magnificent frame silhouetted against the lights. His wild cry echoed through the auction house, not the sound of an animal in distress, but something that sounded almost like a call, a summons to courage. The sound broke Cordelia's paralysis. She raised her weathered hand, her voice barely audible above the crowd's murmur, $1. The auction house fell silent. Even the auctioneer paused, his gavel frozen mid-air. Heads turned toward Cordelia, faces displaying everything from confusion to outright mockery. Maximilian burst into laughter. Did that old crone just bid $1? Security should escort her out before she embarrasses herself further. But the auctioneer, a man who had been in the business for 30 years, had seen stranger things. More importantly, he had noticed what the bidders had missed: Tempest's reaction to Cordelia's presence. The stallion had gone completely still, his ears pricked forward, his entire being focused on the woman who had dared to bid everything she had. "I have a bid of $1, the auctioneer announced, his voice carrying an odd note of respect. "Do I hear 700,001? The room erupted in chaos. Maximilian and Prudence looked at each other with bewilderment, unsure whether to laugh or be insulted. Other bidders whispered among themselves, wondering if this was some kind of elaborate joke. But in the arena, something magical was happening. Tempest walked slowly toward the barrier closest to Cordelia, his movements graceful and deliberate. The stallion stopped just inches from the rail and lowered his great head, his amber eyes never leaving hers. For a moment that stretched into eternity, the auction house held its breath. Rich and poor, powerful and powerless, all watched as something inexplicable passed between the wild stallion and the woman who had risked her last dollar on an impossible dream. The auctioneer raised his gavel one final time, and in that moment, Cordelia knew that regardless of the outcome, she had already won something far more valuable than any of them could possibly understand. The silence in the auction house stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Maximilian and Prudence exchanged glances that could have melted steel, their faces twisted with indignation at the audacity of the old woman's bid. "This is preposterous!" Maximilian sputtered, his face purple with rage. "You can't seriously consider a $1 bid against 700,000. The auctioneer, however, was studying the scene with the keen eye of a man who had witnessed thousands of sales. His name was Harrison Kensington, and in his 3 decades of conducting auctions, he had never seen anything quite like this. The stallion's behavior was beyond unusual. It was unprecedented. "The bidding stands at $700,000, Harrison announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Do I hear 700,001? Prudence's paddle shot up immediately. $700,001. "I have $700,001, Harrison called out. "Do I hear any other bids?" The room waited. Everyone expected Cordelia to shrink back, to realize the futility of her gesture. But the elderly woman stood slowly, her joints protesting every movement, and looked directly at the auctioneer. $2, she said, her voice carrying across. The silent auction house with surprising strength. The crowd erupted in a mixture of laughter and outrage. Maximilian slammed his paddle down on his knee, snapping it in half. "This is absurd! She's making a mockery of this entire proceeding, but—" In the arena, Tempest had moved even closer to Cordelia. The stallion's behavior was so unusual that the horse handlers were beginning to whisper among themselves. Dr. Evangeline Porter, the veterinarian overseeing the sale, had never seen anything like it in her 20 years of working with wild horses. $702, Prudence bid through gritted teeth, her composure finally cracking. $3, Cordelia responded without hesitation. The pattern continued, each millionaire adding to their astronomical bid, only to have Cordelia counter with a single dollar more. The crowd's laughter gradually died away as they began to realize something extraordinary was happening. This wasn't just about money anymore. It had become a battle of wills, a test of something far more precious than wealth. Tempest's behavior grew more remarkable with each bid. The stallion, who had been violent and unpredictable since his capture, stood, perfectly still, his attention fixed on Cordelia as if she were the only person in the room. His amber eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human, and more than one observer swore they could see understanding in those depths. By the time Cordelia's bid reached $50, something had shifted in the room. The mockery had turned to fascination, then to something approaching awe. Even the millionaires found themselves bidding more tentatively, as if they were beginning to understand that this was no longer about acquiring a horse. It was about witnessing something that defied explanation. "This is insane," Maximilian muttered, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "She has $50. We're bidding hundreds of thousands." "Maybe," Prudence whispered, her eyes fixed on the stallion. "That's exactly the point." Dr. Porter stepped forward, her professional curiosity overcoming protocol. "Harrison," she called to the auctioneer, "I need to examine this horse's behavior. This is unlike anything I've ever documented." The auctioneer nodded, understanding the significance of the moment. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a brief recess to allow Dr. Porter to assess the situation." As the crowd murmured among themselves, Cordelia remained standing, her eyes locked with Tempest's. The stallion stretched his neck toward her, and for one impossible moment she could swear she heard him whisper her name on the wind. $53. That's all she had left in the world, and she was bidding it against people who could buy and sell her 1,000 times over. But as she looked into Tempest's eyes, she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. Dr. Porter approached the arena with the careful steps of someone who had spent decades reading the subtle languages of animals. Her clipboard trembled slightly in her hands, not from nervousness, but from the sheer impossibility of what she was witnessing. Tempest stood motionless at the barrier, his massive frame radiating a calm that seemed to emanate from the very core of his being. The stallion, who had kicked down steel doors and sent 3 professional trainers to the hospital, now stood as gentle as a lamb, his amber eyes fixed on Cordelia with a devotion that defied every principle of animal behavior Dr. Porter had ever studied. "In 30 years of veterinary practice," she announced to the hushed crowd, "I have never observed anything like this. This stallion has shown aggressive behavior toward every human he's encountered since capture. His stress levels have been dangerously high, his cortisol through the roof. But right now," she paused, studying the readings on her portable monitor, "his heart rate is completely normal. His breathing is steady. He's exhibiting signs of what can only be described as profound peace." Harrison Kensington stepped forward, his weathered face grave with the weight of responsibility. "Dr. Porter, are you saying this horse has formed some kind of bond with Mrs.—" He looked questioningly at Cordelia. "Whitmore," she supplied quietly. "Cordelia Whitmore." "With Mrs. Whitmore?" Harrison continued. "I'm saying," Dr. Porter replied, her voice filled with wonder, "that this horse has chosen her. Not because of money, not because of status, but because of something we can't measure or quantify. Something that speaks to the very essence of what connection means, Maximilian scoffed, but his bluster seemed forced now. This is all very touching. But we're talking about a $700,000 horse. She has $53. 52, Cordelia corrected softly. I bid $52. The distinction seemed to hang in the air like a challenge. Prudence, who had been silent for several minutes, suddenly stood up. Her face was thoughtful, as if she were working through a complex equation in her mind. I've been thinking, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the arena. I've bought 17 horses in my lifetime, spent over $2 million. Do you know what every single one of them had in common? She paused, looking around the room. Not one of them ever looked at me the way that stallion is looking at her? The crowd stirred uneasily. This wasn't the way these auctions were supposed to go. Wealth was supposed to win. Money was supposed to be the final arbiter of who deserved what. But Tempest had different ideas. As if sensing the shift in the room's energy, the stallion did something that left everyone speechless. He lowered his great head and gently nuzzled the air in Cordelia's direction, a gesture so tender, so filled with longing, that several people in the crowd found themselves wiping away tears. I've spent my entire life believing that money could buy anything, Maximilian said quietly, his voice barely audible. But I've never had anything look at me like that. Not my wife, not my children, not even my dogs. He stood slowly, his broken paddle falling to the floor. I withdraw my bid. The announcement sent shockwaves through the crowd. One by one, other bidders began to follow suit. The oil heiress from Texas, the tech mogul from California, the pharmaceutical executive from New York, each withdrew their bids, as if finally understanding that this was about something money couldn't purchase. Finally, only Prudence remained. She looked at Cordelia for a long moment, then at Tempest, then back at Cordelia. You know, she said with a smile that transformed her entire face, I think $52 might be the most honest bid this auction has ever seen. She set down her paddle and began to clap. The sound echoed through the marble halls, soon joined by others. Within moments, the entire auction house was applauding, not for wealth or status, but for something far more precious, the recognition that true value couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. Harrison raised his gavel, his voice thick with emotion. I have a bid of $52, going once, going twice. Cordelia closed her eyes and whispered a prayer to whatever force had brought her to this impossible moment. The gavel hung suspended in the air like a judgment from the heavens. Harrison Kensington had presided over thousands of auctions, but he had never felt the weight of a single moment quite like this. The entire auction house held its breath, rich and poor united in anticipation of what would happen next. Sold! Harrison's voice rang out clear and strong. To Mrs. Cordelia Whitmore for $52. The applause that erupted wasn't the polite clapping typical of auction houses. It was thunderous, heartfelt, and filled with something that had been missing from the sterile world of high society horse trading, genuine emotion. Grown men wept openly, and women clutched their hearts as if witnessing a miracle. But the real magic happened in the arena. The moment the gavel fell, Tempest reared up on his hind legs, not in aggression, but in pure, unbridled joy. His wild cry echoed through the hall, a sound of triumph that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. When he came down, he galloped in a perfect circle around the arena, his silver mane streaming like a banner of victory. Cordelia stood frozen, her weathered hands pressed to her mouth. I can't believe it, she whispered. I actually won. Ma'am, Dr. Porter said gently, approaching with a clipboard, we'll need to arrange transport for your horse. Do you have a trailer? A facility prepared for him? The question hit Cordelia like a bucket of ice water. In her wildest dreams, she had never actually expected to win. She had no trailer, no stable, no money for feed or veterinary care. She lived in a tiny apartment above the diner where she had worked for the past 20 years, barely scraping by on tips and her small Social Security check. She began, then stopped. The magnitude of what she had just done began to sink. She had won a wild stallion with no way to care for him. Maximilian, who had been watching the scene unfold, stepped forward. His earlier arrogance had been replaced by something that looked almost like respect. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly, "I own the Lone Star Ranch about 20 miles from here. It's 15,000 acres of the finest grazing land in Montana." Cordelia looked at him warily, unsure where this was leading. "I'd like to offer you and Tempest a place to stay," he continued. "No charge, no strings attached. You've taught me something today about what real value means." Before Cordelia could respond, Prudence stepped forward as well. "And I'd like to cover all of Tempest's care, veterinary bills, feed, whatever he needs. Consider it my contribution to something beautiful." Others began to join in. The oil heiress offered to pay for professional training if Tempest ever decided he wanted to be ridden. The tech mogul volunteered to set up a fund for Cordelia's living expenses. The pharmaceutical executive offered to provide medical care for both woman and horse. Dr. Porter watched the outpouring with professional fascination. "I've never seen anything like this," she murmured. "It's as if this horse has brought out the best in everyone here." Harrison stepped down from the podium, his official duties complete, but his personal interest just beginning. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "would you mind telling us how you knew? How did you know that $52 would be enough?" Cordelia looked around at the faces surrounding her, faces that had been cold and dismissive just hours ago, but now shone with warmth and genuine curiosity. "I didn't know," she admitted. "I've been saving money for 3 years, working double shifts at the diner, putting away every penny I could. I had this crazy dream that maybe, just maybe, I could buy a horse. Not a fancy one, just any horse. That needed a friend." She paused, looking toward Tempest, who stood calmly in the arena as if he were listening to every word. "When I saw him, I knew he was the one. Not because he was the most expensive or the most beautiful, but because he looked at me the way I've always wanted to be looked at. Like I mattered. Like I was worth something." The crowd stood in respectful silence, absorbing the simple truth of her words. In a world where value was measured in dollars and status was determined by bank accounts, an elderly woman with $52 had just reminded them all of something they had forgotten, that the most precious things in life couldn't be bought or sold. They could only be given freely from one heart to another. Tempest whinnied softly from the arena, as if adding his own amen to her words. 6 months later, the Lone Star Ranch had been transformed into something magical. What had once been Maximilian's private showcase of wealth had become a sanctuary where the impossible happened daily. Visitors came from across the country, not to see expensive horses or luxurious facilities, but to witness the bond between an elderly woman and a wild stallion that had captured the hearts of everyone who encountered them. Cordelia had never learned to ride in the traditional sense. She was 73 years old, her joints stiff with arthritis, and Tempest stood nearly 17 hands high. But what they shared transcended the need for saddles or bridles. Every morning, Cordelia would walk out to the pasture where Tempest waited, and the great stallion would lower his head so she could rest her weathered hand against his neck. They would walk together through the Montana meadows, woman and horse moving in perfect synchronization, as if they shared the same heartbeat. Tempest, who had never been ridden by anyone, would sometimes kneel down so Cordelia could climb onto his back. Together they would roam the vast ranch, her hands tangled in his silver mane, both of them free in a way they had never been before. The story of their bond had spread far beyond Montana. News crews came to document the miracle of the $52 horse. Reporters struggled to capture the essence of what they witnessed, but their cameras couldn't record the invisible threads that connected Cordelia and Tempest, couldn't measure the healing that occurred when two lost souls found each other. Dr. Porter had written several papers about their relationship, but even her scientific training couldn't fully explain what she observed. "It defies every principle of animal behavior I've studied," she admitted to a gathering of veterinarians. But perhaps that's exactly the point. Perhaps there are connections that exist beyond our understanding, bonds that form not from training or conditioning but from something far more profound. The other millionaires who had bid on Tempest had become regular visitors to the ranch. Maximilian had discovered that hosting Cordelia and Tempest filled an emptiness in his life that all his wealth had never touched. Prudence had started a foundation dedicated to connecting rescued animals with people who needed healing, inspired by what she had witnessed that day in the auction house. "You know what's funny?" Maximilian said one evening as they all sat on the ranch's front porch, watching Cordelia and Tempest graze in the twilight. "I spent millions trying to buy happiness, but I never found it until I watched her spend $52 on a dream." The diner where Cordelia had worked for 20 years had been transformed as well. Her former boss had framed the newspaper clipping about the auction and hung it behind the counter. "She showed us all that it doesn't matter where you come from or how much money you have," he told curious visitors. "What matters is the size of your heart." Children from local schools made regular field trips to see Cordelia and Tempest. The elderly woman, who had lived most of her life invisible and forgotten, now found herself surrounded by young faces eager to hear her story. She would sit on hay bales, Tempest standing protectively beside her, and tell them about the day she bid everything she had on a dream. "The most important thing," she would always tell them, "is not to let anyone convince you that your dreams are too small or too big. Dreams don't have price tags. They just need someone brave enough to believe in them." As the sun set over the Montana plains, Cordelia would often find herself reflecting on the miraculous chain of events that had brought her to this moment. She had entered that auction house as a forgotten old woman with nothing but hope and $52. She had emerged as someone who had reminded the world that true value couldn't be measured in currency. Tempest had been transformed as well. The wild stallion who had fought against every attempt to break his spirit had chosen to give his heart freely to someone who saw his worth not in his bloodline or his potential for profit, but in the fierce beauty of his untamed soul. On quiet evenings, when the ranch was peaceful and the stars began to appear, Cordelia would rest her head against Tempest's neck and whisper, "Thank you for choosing me." And in the gentle rumble of his breathing, in the way he curved his great neck to shelter her, she could swear she heard him whisper back, "Thank you for believing we were both worth more than money could ever buy." Their story became more than just a tale of an unlikely victory at an auction. It became a reminder that in a world obsessed with wealth and status, the most precious things, love, loyalty, connection, and faith, still couldn't be bought or sold. They could only be given freely from one heart to another in the simple act of believing that everyone and everything deserves to be cherished. And in the end, that $52 bid had purchased something priceless. Proof that dreams, no matter how impossible they seem, are always worth the price of hope.